The pressure from the collapse blew me out the door, and that's probably what saved my life, because I couldn't have gotten out on my own.
As I was walking in, I slipped on the tile floor and hit my head.
And I was just in the motion of doing my lifting and turning, and it tore my rotator cuff.
Simply getting out of one of the cars and twisted my knee wrong and heard a pop.
Who would think you could get hurt by sitting wrong?
I went into the other lane of traffic, bounced off that mountainside, came back into my lane of traffic, and that's when I spun down into the creek, going nose first on the vehicle, and then flipped over on its top.
The stories you have just heard are real-life incidents involving public entity employees. In each case, these employees were seriously injured because they were not aware of a potential hazard, did not evaluate the hazard adequately, or did not use the proper controls to prevent the accident from happening. The fact is that many of the things we do, on or off the job, expose us to a variety of hazardous conditions that can result in injuries. Whether we're driving a vehicle, operating a computer, trimming weeds, or performing other tasks, there is some level of potential risk in all jobs. In order to minimize these risks, a three-step hazard awareness program should be followed. 1. Identify potential hazards associated with each job through awareness and safety inspections. 2. Evaluate the level of risk to determine if these hazards may cause frequent or severe accidents. And 3. Control the hazards so accidents are prevented or their probability is reduced. When we are successful in following these 3 steps, accidents and injuries like the ones described earlier can be prevented. An effective hazard awareness program will also prevent or minimize property damage, stabilize insurance costs, help maintain community services, enhance our public image, and keep employee morale positive and productive. This video program and the accompanying handbook were developed by CIRSA to help you realize that hazard awareness is everyone's responsibility.
I saw the box. I didn't think it was going to be a hazard. I certainly didn't think it was going to cause such a severe injury.
Even the smallest thing that you don't think could be a hazard actually can be.
There's hazards that can cost you your livelihood or cost you your life. And they're all right here on the job.
So what exactly is a hazard? A hazard can be defined as any condition or practice that has the potential to cause harm, including injury or death to persons and damage to property. Hazards can include both unsafe conditions and at-risk behaviors. In many cases, a combination of factors can create an accident. For example, this driver was talking on her cell phone. The sun was in her eyes, and she didn't see the vehicle stopped ahead. Damage to her city vehicle was substantial. Hazard identification is the first step in controlling the conditions and behaviors that cause accidents. Before we can control hazards, we must be able to recognize and identify their potential risk. Most hazards can be grouped into 3 categories: physical hazards, environmental hazards, or behavioral hazards. Let's look at some examples of each. Physical hazards encompass a wide variety of conditions found in our buildings, parks, and roadways. Common physical hazards include slip and trip hazards from uneven sidewalks, slick floors, unsafe playground equipment, or poor housekeeping. Fire hazards such as improperly stored combustible materials, flammable liquids, or open flames. Shock hazards from poorly maintained or overloaded electrical equipment. Collision hazards with vehicles and heavy equipment. Pinch, crush, and cut hazards created by machinery, tools, and equipment. And ergonomic hazards from working at improperly designed workstations. Common environmental hazards include exposure to toxic chemicals like chlorine gas or pesticides, dangerous working conditions such as high noise, inadequate lighting, and extreme hot or cold temperatures. exposure to inclement weather such as ice and snow, high winds, or lightning, and exposure to biological hazards that can include contact with infectious diseases like HIV, hepatitis, or West Nile virus. The third hazard category is behavioral hazards, which include at-risk behaviors by employees or the general public. Some examples are not following established safety rules or procedures, such as improperly lifting heavy objects and straining your back, working while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, while you are tired, or after taking prescription medications that make you drowsy, and an act of workplace violence by an angry citizen or a combative person resisting arrest. Most accidents have at least one at-risk behavior as a root cause. There are many reasons why someone will perform an at-risk behavior. They may feel pressure to get a job done quickly. They don't have the right training. Adequate tools are not available. Or they have the attitude that it's simply more comfortable or convenient to do the job unsafely. When you notice a coworker performing an at-risk behavior, warn them of the potential risk. Many entities have already implemented an employee observation and feedback system. Observing work habits and providing feedback to coworkers is an effective way of minimizing at-risk behaviors and reducing accidents. It will also show your concern for your fellow employees' safety. Ultimately, every employee has the responsibility to maintain a safe workplace. Employees should constantly observe the workplace for any unsafe conditions and at-risk behaviors. An effective way to accurately identify hazards as either physical, environmental, or behavioral is to perform periodic safety inspections. The type and frequency of safety inspections may vary depending on what is being inspected. For example, Department of Transportation regulations require daily inspections of commercial vehicles, such as buses and snowplows. Other items, such as playground equipment, should be inspected monthly, and more often during periods of high use. Sanitary sewer lines should be inspected every 18 to 36 months, and more often if there is a history of backups. The types of equipment that require inspections and the frequency of your inspections should be clearly defined as part of your hazard awareness program. Your program should also define who is responsible for conducting these safety inspections. In some entities, members of the safety committee will conduct inspections. Standardized forms should be used, such as the samples in the accompanying manual, and inspections conducted according to a predetermined schedule. Employees who are responsible for the operation of certain equipment, such as firearms or self-contained breathing apparatus, must be trained in how to conduct their own regular inspections. For complex equipment, like boilers and aerial lifts, outside firms may need to be utilized.
I should be able to identify those risks or those potential risks in my line of work.
Never thought about it, never thought it was a hazard. I mean, this was the first time I had ever fallen.
We failed to realize how quickly things could go from bad to worse.
Step 2 of the Hazard Awareness Program is hazard evaluation. This is where we assess the potential danger of a hazard. Hazards that are likely to cause frequent and severe accidents are of more concern than those that pose little threat of physical injury or property damage. There are various techniques to evaluate the magnitude of a hazard. One method is to review past records of accidents, injuries, and near misses. For example, we know that working in trenches has resulted in fatalities from cave-ins. Operating motor vehicles has resulted in numerous serious accidents. And lifting heavy objects has caused many back injuries. Once we evaluate our data and determine which jobs are high risk, we can take the necessary safety precautions to reduce the potential hazards. Another tool to evaluate hazards is a risk matrix chart, which compares the potential frequency and severity of a hazard and then charts it as a low, medium, or high risk. Low-risk hazards have little probability for a serious injury. An example might be the normal operation of a copy machine. Other than the built-in safety guards, no other type of hazard controls are necessary. Medium risk hazards have a higher possibility of injury if proper controls are not utilized. An example would be removing a manhole cover. Strain and sprain injuries are certainly possible, but not life-threatening. Controls such as lifting devices and using proper body mechanics should be used to prevent injuries. High-risk hazards have a significant probability of severe injuries or property damage if proper controls are not used. An example would be a high-speed pursuit, the handling of chlorine gas, or a confined space entry. Strict policies and procedures should be established to control these high-risk hazards. Accurately evaluating hazards will help to identify which jobs or situations pose the greatest risk. Fortunately, many of the jobs we perform have already been evaluated for possible hazards and proper controls implemented. However, if you are unfamiliar with a job activity or are unsure of the potential hazards, contact your supervisor. In complex situations, engineers, safety professionals, industrial hygienists, and other experts may be consulted to help evaluate the hazards and recommend controls.
I think it's a very good idea to have these walk-in mats to clean your feet before you walk in.
We're taking more time to share the loads with each other and not trying to lift more than what we physically can.
My supervisor held a review on proper lifting techniques to cover for the entire department so that everyone would know the processes to be used.
You don't need to be in a hurry. You don't need to pass on a mountain if you don't need to pass. Recognize that there may be snow or ice or something on the road and just slow down.
Once you have identified a hazard and evaluated its potential risk, step 3 in the Hazard Awareness Program is hazard control. In this step, one or more safeguards are implemented to either remove the hazard or protect against it. If a hazard exists that poses an imminent danger to a person's life or health, immediate action should be taken to remove the hazard, isolate the scene, and protect the person. If possible, try to completely eliminate the hazard. If it's no longer present, no one can get hurt. However, completely eliminating the hazard is not always possible. Some hazards are inherent to a particular job, machine, or activity. For example, we know that operating motor vehicles can be hazardous, yet there are tremendous benefits to using vehicles. Since we can't eliminate vehicle usage, we establish a number of controls to reduce the frequency and severity of accidents. These include safe road design and construction, building more crash-worthy vehicles, enforcing seatbelt policies, and providing defensive driver training. In some situations, it may take time and money to implement a permanent solution to control a hazard. In these cases, short-term controls should be implemented that will help prevent an injury from occurring. An example would be a noisy piece of equipment. Money may not be available to install sound barriers right away, but proper hearing protection can be worn to protect workers from the noise. When considering how to remove, isolate, or protect against a hazard, 3 types of controls can be implemented: engineering, administrative, or personal protective equipment. Engineering controls involve some modification to the work environment, such as adding a flexible ventilation system to a welding station. Other examples include machine guards and material handling equipment. Administrative controls include establishing safety policies, procedures, and rules that help reduce exposure to a known hazard. Posting of warning signs, job rotations, performance reviews, and safety training are all examples of administrative controls. Personal protective equipment, or PPE, is safety equipment worn by people as a protective barrier between themselves and a hazard. The success of this control is dependent on selecting the right PPE. keeping it well maintained, and making sure it fits correctly and is worn properly by employees when needed. Personal protective equipment should be the last line of defense in protecting workers against hazards. Engineering and administrative controls should be implemented first whenever possible. Some jobs require a combination of these controls to adequately protect against a hazard. For example, in a confined space entry, engineering controls may include a ventilation system. Administrative controls would be the written permit, and necessary PPE includes hard hats, an air monitor, and an extraction system. After the appropriate controls have been implemented, follow-up is required to ensure that the controls are effectively isolating the hazard. But who is responsible for this follow-up? Again, we're all responsible. If you are able to eliminate or control a hazard on the spot, such as cleaning up a liquid spill, then do so immediately. If more extensive controls are required, report it to your supervisor so they can coordinate corrective measures. Let's look at a hazardous situation and watch as our hazard awareness program is implemented. While conducting a daily park inspection, a parks worker notices a wet and muddy bike path. Upon further observation, he discovers a large sunken hole near the path. Water on the bike path may not be a big concern, but when combined with mud, the risk of a person slipping and falling increases substantially. Also, if a jogger steps in the sinkhole, a serious injury may occur. The parks worker determines that the hazard has been created by a broken sprinkler head. He calls his supervisor and requests maintenance to fix the problem. In the meantime, he verbally warns a nearby runner to avoid the hazard. He then retrieves some orange cones from his truck to place around the area. This will temporarily isolate the hazards and warn pedestrians to the danger. Later that afternoon, the parks worker checks back to make sure the problem is being corrected and the hazards eliminated.
It's my responsibility, I think, to inform management if I run into a situation that I feel is hazardous and I can't control.
It's not worth it to take shortcuts. You should be aware of your surroundings.
Ultimately, if you get hurt, it's not worth it.
It's cost me at least 2 years of continuous pain.
Not only does it affect you, it affects your family.
It only takes less than a second to think about it, you do it correctly, and then you go home every day without an injury.
Let's summarize the key points of our hazard awareness program. Hazards include both unsafe conditions and at-risk behaviors that can cause accidents which lead to injuries and property damage. In order to prevent accidents and injuries, you should follow a 3-step program of hazard identification, hazard evaluation, and hazard control. Hazards can be classified into 3 groups: physical, environmental, or behavioral. Your entity should establish an ongoing safety inspection system that includes forms and procedures for documenting hazards. Learn to evaluate hazards and assess the magnitude of their potential to cause frequent and severe injuries or property damage. Once you identify a hazard and evaluate its potential risk, determine the appropriate means to control it. One or more engineering, administrative, or PPE controls may be needed to protect people and property from the danger. And finally, you should follow up to make sure your hazard controls are working effectively.
I'm ultimately responsible for my own safety.
I think I'm responsible for my own safety. I'm the one that's got to be aware.
Watching your hazards is very important in this line of work because it can kill you.
Hazard awareness is first and foremost your individual responsibility.
I think we all need to be thinking about our safety and the safety of the people around us at all times, because even minor situations can get you killed.
By actively participating in your entity's hazard awareness program, you'll be doing your part to prevent injuries to yourself, your fellow employees, and the general public. You'll also be helping to minimize property damage and make your entity a safer place to work.